So welcome. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the U.S.-Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. And this is the first in a series of occasional webinars that we are hosting this spring and early summer on the subject of women's rights in international law. Today's speaker is Judith Bauder. Judith is a lecturer and researcher in public international and human rights law at the University of Vienna. Together with NYU law professor José Alvarez, she has co-authored a book on the jurisprudence of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women with respect to property rights. The book will be published in the coming months by Oxford University Press. Judith has advised various international lawmakers, including the International Law Commission at the UN in Geneva and the Public International Law Committee of the UN General Assembly. She was a Fulbright Scholar and earned an LLM in International Legal Studies from NYU School of Law. Also participating in today's webinar is Gao Yuan, who is a research scholar at the U.S.-Asia Law Institute. Gao Yuan prepared a study package of CEDAW materials that Judith will be discussing. You can find the study package on our website. The link will be put in the chat for anyone who has not yet found it or downloaded it. And we're also uploading the lecture slides that we'll be showing this morning to the same page on our website, and you can download the slides for future reference if you wish. So I'm going to turn the mic now over to our speaker, Judith Bauder, and let her get into it.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for this warm-hearted introduction. It's wonderful to be here tonight with you. I'm calling in from Vienna in Austria, and I'm very excited to be sharing with you this very important topic on CEDAW and women's property rights. I'd like to tell you what I will tell you today. So this is my name, just that you can identify, and say a couple of words about the content of the webinar and what we will address today in those brief 90 minutes. I will start by giving you an overview of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the optional protocol and the different procedures, who the CEDAW committee is. I will then go on and speak about the substantive protection in the area of property rights, and we will address 3 different topic areas: property rights in family relations, land and housing rights, and also property rights and gender-based violence, because those 2 areas are connected in important ways, and I think it's important for you to know this. And in the end, we will briefly talk about advocacy opportunities with the committee, and also how you can get access and what these different procedures are useful for, and how you could also write to the CEDAW committee. Okay, let's begin with talking briefly about the convention. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is almost a universally ratified human rights convention. 189 state parties have not only signed it, which means that states can no longer do something that would be against the object and purpose of the treaty, but they have also ratified it. And that means they want to be fully bound by all the different rights that are in the convention. They have signed up for state obligations, and they have submitted themselves to this important international treaty. When was it adopted? In 1979, and it entered into force in 1981. And that means as soon as a state signed and ratified, that state is bound by that convention from that day on, and they must start fulfilling the different state obligations. If you had the convention in your hands, and I think that's something I want to encourage you to do as a public international lawyer. It is split in different parts, and I think it's important to notice it has 6 parts in total. In the beginning, there's the preamble. It tells you about what the different states wanted to achieve when they negotiated this international treaty together. And it's basically, it has one goal: to eliminate all discrimination against women, no matter where they are in the world, no matter what their identity is. That brings me to the most important provision in the convention, and that's Article 1, which entails the prohibition of all discrimination against women. It's very important that we come back to it because it's one of the provisions in the convention that the CEDAW committee has used in order to also interpret new rights that are not explicitly mentioned in the convention. And then from Article 2 on, it regulates what are the obligations of states. And that is, for instance, that you have to change laws, that you have to provide equal protection clauses in the Constitution, that you also have to protect women against other private actors. And who are private actors? It could be family members, or it could also be corporation. But the state has actually a due diligence obligation, and I will come to that later on again, to protect women. It also states that states must eliminate stereotypes, for instance, that you have only videos of women being caretakers. Women also can be presidents, or they can also be having very important roles in the public. So that's one. And then the last very important state obligation is also that states have temporary protection obligations, and that means they must immediately do something in order to eliminate discrimination. For our purposes today, there's many substantive rights provisions, but because we talk about property rights provisions today, we particularly will address Article 14 that protects rural women's land and housing rights, Article 15 that protects the equality in front of the law, basically, so legal equality of women when they conclude contracts and so on and so forth, and property rights in family relations. That is regulated in Article 16. There's also many other important substantive provisions, and I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A, but we will focus on those today. I will point out one more important part. I already mentioned the CEDAW committee. That is also something that's regulated in the convention, and it has the right to do certain things. And that's where you find the procedures, and I will explain them in a second. And last, the convention also regulates the relationship of the international law to the domestic law. So when a state has signed and ratified the convention, then it's still an international treaty that somehow must become part of domestic law. And when, for instance, a state signs a reservation, when it comes into the treaty regime, that would mean it's not fully bound. When a state doesn't have a reservation, then it means from the day on it has ratified the convention, it is fully bound by this convention. I will talk in substance about the different provisions, but that is just to give you an overview. Let's move on to the next slide. I have already mentioned that there are special procedures on the convention. So there's the CEDAW committee sitting in Geneva, and it provides general recommendations to all the state parties. In those general recommendations, it interprets the different substantive right provisions, like, for instance, the rights of rural women to their land. And the CEDAW committee has said in such a general recommendation what it must protect and how states must understand the obligations they have signed on to and that they want to be bound by. And that is usually 20 pages long, and it has great authority because the treaty body in Geneva says, this is how we understand your obligations, and you states, you have to implement them. It also, and I think that is very important for the individual state parties, it also provides concluding observations. There it makes recommendations to a particular individual state. Every 4 years, a state must submit a report to the CEDAW committee, where it tells the CEDAW committee how women's rights are basically treated in their country and what they do in order to ensure greater equality, and what they do to ensure that discrimination is prohibited in all areas of life, whether it's economic, social, or cultural life, whether it's women's right to vote, or whether it's women's right to equal property in their family relations. So in this state report, the state tells the committee basically what they have complied by, what they have abided by, what they have done in order to improve women's rights in a specific country. And then the CEDAW committee replies in those concluding observations and makes recommendations. It expresses concerns when women's rights are violated in certain parts of the world. And it also tells the states what they can do to improve the situation. So this happens all for years. It is a public procedure that you can also watch on UN Web TV. And in the end, there will be a written report, and civil society organizations can also provide shadow reports and provide their view, what could be improved regarding state reports. But that is basically like a communication procedure between the state and the CEDAW committee. And the entire goal of this procedure is to improve women's equality around the world. Okay, I think we can move on now to another special procedure. I have already mentioned that there's not just a convention, but also an optional protocol. And this optional protocol is introducing additional procedures where also individuals can complain to the CEDAW committee under certain criteria, and where the CEDAW committee can also undertake inquiries when there are systematic and grave breaches of women's rights in certain parts of the world. But I should let you know that in order to be part of this system, the state must sign on and ratify in addition. And that only 115 states have decided to do so. And you would need to check if the state where you are from has done so or not, and I think it has not. But I think this is important to tell you that this procedure exists. And the output is, again, the communication. So it's an individual against the state. In Geneva, there is the CEDAW committee. It's a quasi-jurisprudential function. So it's like a court that hears the complaint once a woman has exhausted all domestic remedies. So it must have gone to every court and have exhausted every procedure in that respective country to even get to the human rights mechanism in Geneva. But once it has done so, and once the CEDAW committee has thought that a human right was violated of that particular woman, then it again provides recommendations. These recommendations are not in essence binding, but again, they enjoy a great authority. And once the CEDAW committee has made a recommendation to a state that they must first stop the violation happening against a particular woman, and second, that they generally also must improve the situation in the country for all other women who experience a different or like a similar human rights violation, then a state must take this very serious and do something about it. And once the committee has provided these recommendations that are not a verdict, but something similar to what you would get from a court, then it will also follow up and ask again in 6 months. So state, have you implemented something? Have you changed the situation for the individual? And have you improved the situation in general? There's not a lot of communications, only 55. The optional protocol has been adopted in 1999 and it entered into force in 2000. And since the year 2000, only 55 communications were decided on the merits, on the substance. So even when a state decides, okay, we subject ourselves to this procedure and we open up this complaint procedure for individual women, then very, very few actually complain to the mechanism in Geneva, and also very, very few then get a communication. The inquiry reports I already mentioned are also very important because they highlight systematic and grave breaches. in order to get an inquiry report from the CEDAW committee, a state must really want it, and that's why it must provide an additional consent. And it must cooperate with the CEDAW committee so that the CEDAW committee could come, for instance, to that country and investigate on the ground, ask the state, ask civil society, what is going on, what is happening with those human rights violations? Are they true? Have they really happened? Are they systematic? Do they happen all the time? And are they very, very grave? I give you one example, and we will come to one later also. It was, for instance, that women were disappeared in Canada, Aboriginal women, and a lot of them were murdered. And eventually Canada agreed and said, okay, CEDAW committee, you can come, we have to investigate this human rights violation because we are also concerned about it. And it's very important that a state cooperates in order to have such an inquiry. You will notice that an inquiry procedure is even more difficult to get states' consent from. And thus far, there only have been 7 since the year 2000. But I think it's also important to know about it. So those are the different procedures. I already mentioned the CEDAW committee, and I call it a human rights mechanism, a human rights treaty body. But it's a mechanism that sometimes operates like a court, that sometimes operates like an expert group that has special expertise in the area of women's rights. But it was set up by the convention that states signed. And if you were to look through the convention, you'll find it in the procedural part. But it's 23 women experts. They come from all world regions, as you can see on the picture, and there's a different ratio of how many members are from the different world regions, but they all have special expertise in women's rights. And what is also important is some of them are lawyers, and some of them come from other backgrounds. Like, for instance, they might be a specialist in sociology, or they might be psychologists. But this has worked out as an advantage for the CEDAW committee because women's rights require expertise in different areas. What is their main purpose and what is their main function? So they have a mandate that was afforded to them by the convention, by CEDAW, to monitor states and to ensure that the different rights that are protected by CEDAW are implemented. And they meet always 4 times a year. They meet in Geneva for 2 to 3 weeks in different working groups. But part of those sessions are for all state parties when they develop the different general recommendations. And parts of them only deal with the state reporting I mentioned before. There's then a constructive dialogue session where the state answers the CEDAW committee. There's a country special rapporteur that will deal with that particular country. And there's also a slot for civil society so that also civil society can be in the room. And when the CEDAW committee meets as a plenary, then you can also participate and listen because these sessions will be public. Other sessions are confidential, but most of the sessions will be public, and you can hear what the CEDAW committee says to state parties around the world, what they do about women's rights in their respective countries. Okay, this is all I want to tell you about the general content, and I think we have a brief moment for questions.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that we just stop a second and ask whether the audience has any questions, because it's very fundamental and maybe new to a lot of those in the audience. So if you have any questions about the concept of CEDAW, the committee's role, or CEDAW jurisprudence, you can put your questions in the chat box. You can put either in English or Chinese. And at the same time, we want to know your preference among like 3 topics that we talked about. So I'm going to launch another poll. You can just help us learn like by clicking the options that you feel you are most interested in learning. maybe I can just take the liberty to ask a question of my own. Yeah, I think like people may want to know, like, looks like some of the CEDAW committee's communications, they are not binding, especially the concluding observations of other countries, or like inquiry report of other countries, or like views on individual communications. So what are those like impacts of those communications on other states like parties? Why are they so important?
Thank you, Amy. That's an excellent question. I have mentioned before that the CEDAW committee provides general recommendations to all state parties. Whether they have signed on to the optional protocol or not will not matter. However, in those general recommendations, the CEDAW committee itself refers to these communications it has given to individual countries. It refers to the concluding observations it has given to other countries, and they become part of the jurisprudence, and similar for the inquiry reports, because also in communications and inquiry reports, the committee interprets state obligations. And in the end, they also influence how the CEDAW committee understands certain rights. To mention one example, the country where I am from, there were very important cases where the committee worked on the due diligence obligations, so that states must protect women against husbands that have beaten them or that have killed them. And in those communications, it really developed the prohibition of gender-based violence, and it really developed what it means for a state to have a due diligence obligation. Later on, it cited those different communications in the general recommendations that it then would provide to all state parties. So they are also relevant for state parties that have not signed the optional protocol, because it becomes part of the right understanding of the CEDAW committee. It becomes part of how the CEDAW committee talks to all states when it talks about the prohibition of gender-based violence, when it interprets the different rights that are enshrined in the convention. So they still matter also for states that have not signed the optional protocol, because in the end, that develops a certain understanding how a right must be interpreted around the world. And we will get to the gender-based violence part later, but it could never have developed the prohibition of gender-based violence that today is a crime under customary international law, prohibited even for states that have not even signed the convention, without those communications, without those inquiry reports, without those concluding observations. The CEDAW committee issues every 4 years to states around the world that gender-based violence is prohibited. So, and then it provides the general recommendation to all state parties, and this understanding then becomes very, very clear for all state parties. So it's very useful also for people from states where the state has not decided to sign the optional protocol, to know what's written in those communications and to know what is written in those inquiry reports.
Yeah, so I will end the poll, and like I will also share the result so you guys can see. And looks like the majority of people are very interested in gender-based violence and property rights. And we also have 31% of people, they want to learn more about property rights in family relations, and 21% for women's land rights and housing rights. Oh, wait, I think we have a couple of questions as well in the chat box.
So the one on the US, I think you're better placed to answer. I'm also happy to talk about the weaknesses more of the reporting procedure, but let's maybe do so in the end once we have heard the different substantive parts and where you have seen more of the procedures. And on the last question on same-sex couples, I'm happy to say more in the family relations part. And I will pick up an example there for same-sex relationships and what the CEDAW committee says on that point.
Okay, perfect. And looks like since most people are very interested in gender-based violence and property rights, so why not we just start with that section?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I think that sounds great, Amy. So I think what's important, and I've already told you that there is a prohibition of gender-based violence. And again, I would encourage you to work with the convention and to really use it in order to understand the structure. But you will notice that there is actually no prohibition of gender-based violence in the convention. So it's something that the CEDAW committee had to develop over time. And even, before it started with the state reporting, there was a very important study that said one thing. And I think that I want you all to remember that women never can be treated as the property of men. And I think that is a fundamental connection, that women can't be owned, they can't be possessed, they can't be subjugated to husbands in a way that they are treated as a property of a man. Never. But how did the CEDAW committee then arrive at this conclusion when it, interprets the different convention provisions? It derives it from Article 1, the prohibition of discrimination against women. And it's a form of gender discrimination to subject women to violence. I have mentioned the general recommendations. They are so important for our purposes because there the committee really developed that violence against women is prohibited and what state parties must do about it. The first one was General Recommendation 12 on violence against women in 1989. The second one was General Recommendation 19 on violence against women in 1992. And the most recent one that updated General Recommendation 19 was General Recommendation 35 on gender-based violence against women, and it was issued in 2017. I have explained before, Amy, thanks to your question, why the communications and why the concluding observations in state reports matter so much, because they flow into those general recommendations that then go to all state parties. And a very important point that was taken up by the committee was that women have a right to a life free from gender-based violence, and it's indivisible and interdependent with other human rights. When you take all the money from a woman and she can't get financial credit, she cannot make decisions about what she buys or what she owns, when she cannot go to school because a husband doesn't let her, then this would all be forms of gender-based violence. And they relate to other forms of gender-based violence. Because I think that is also very important to first one note, that violence must be directed against women and it disproportionately affects them. So they must be targeted as a woman. When a woman is killed, we call it a femicide because she might be targeted because she is a woman. It might be the infliction of physical, mental, or sexual harm and the suffering that stems from that. And it's different. It can be acts. It can also be non-acting. It can be coercion, or it could be a deprivation of liberty, for instance, that a woman cannot leave the house without the permission of the man. It could be servitude. It's also important to note that gender-based violence happens at the individual level. It's a social phenomena, and it's an individual problem, but it's also a problem for society. And something that I've said before that's very important, states also must protect you against a family member, for instance, that subjects you to this gender-based violence. The police would need to come to the house and check, or the judiciary would need to hear the case of that woman. But the state has obligations to prevent and to make sure that it doesn't leave those violations unaddressed. It's also important to note, and we all have just around the world went through a world pandemic. It's been a time of crisis, but gender-based violence occurs at times of crisis in rising numbers, whether it's political or economic, or whether it's a social crisis, but gender-based violence numbers are always skyrocketing, especially in those times of crisis. And you can already see that coming up during COVID, that the numbers of gender-based violence were higher. I said gender-based violence occurs in the family. That is something that we've seen in the different general recommendations, and it's very often in this basic unit of society where women disproportionately are affected by violence. But I also want you to understand, and I think it's important to note this, that economic harm is also a form of gender-based violence. And that could be, for instance, that a corporation would not pay women, would not let them go, or that a corporation would dislocate and dispossess women in order to undertake a huge infrastructure project. Another economic harm that is gender-based violence would also be human trafficking. That is also something that the CEDAW committee has pointed out and made clear in its jurisprudence, but that is a particular form of gender-based violence. I will come to another particular form of gender-based violence, what we call property grabbing and dispossession of women. That's usually happening in the family, and it happens in inheritance cases. I will explain this in the family relations part, but I just want to mention the term now because it's also something that the CEDAW committee has made clear. For instance, a husband died, a woman is expelled from the village, and all her possessions are taken from her. This is a form of gender-based violence. Okay, I would suggest we now jump to the slide on state obligations, because I have mentioned that the committee has advised states what they can do when these forms of violence happen to women and when they are gendered. And I've already mentioned an important term, and it's a technical term, that is part of that is what we call due diligence obligations. So when states know or should have known that gender-based violence is committed against women, they must prevent, they must investigate, they must prosecute the perpetrators, and they must punish them, and they must repair the harm that has occurred to that woman. It's a very, very important concept, and the CEDAW committee has been fundamental in developing due diligence obligations. As I have mentioned, these due diligence obligations exist towards private parties, and the state is responsible if it does not prevent, if it does not investigate, if it does not punish, and if it does not repair the harm that is committed by that private party. That is a harm in itself when the state does nothing. And it's very important to, again, think about the different definitions of gender-based violence, because it has these obligations in, like, for instance, towards family member in domestic violence situations, but it also has these due diligence obligations with regard to private actors. And there you could think of market actors, and when gender-based violence occurs as an economic harm. So what must it do then? And you will notice immediately that there might even be competing rights when, for instance, a husband owns the apartment. Nonetheless, the CEDAW committee has said that the woman would be able to stay in that apartment, and that it can intervene in the private property rights of a husband in order to protect the health and the life and the well-being of that particular woman, and also of her children, by the way. That is also very important to know. Again, this is a concept that comes from the country where I am from, because there have been these two communications, Zahid Götze and Fatma Yildirim versus Austria. In those two communications, they were taking place in the early 2000s. The Austrian state failed in those cases, and both women were eventually killed, one in the apartment, one out in the open on the street. There were restraining orders in place. What are restraining and eviction orders? They at least temporarily limit the right of the perpetrator, the husband, to come to the family home or to come to the workplace of the woman. And the CEDAW committee says that's okay, because what we are protecting is the life and the health and the well-being of the women. So we actually can intervene in the private property rights of the husband when this is necessary in order to achieve these other goals. So there must be laws that provide for eviction, protection, or restraining orders against alleged perpetrators. And there also must be a functioning police that would then execute that. And that was the problem, that the police wouldn't come in time, or they didn't check in time. The courts did issue the protection orders, and this led to a reform in Austria where there was additional training, for instance, for the police in order to ensure that not more women are killed. And this was provided in the general recommendations. So on the individual level, the families receive compensations. Of course, the dead mother wouldn't come back, but at least they were compensated for the loss. And then there was the general recommendation to Austria that they have to change something to ensure the safety and well-being of women. I have already said women's right to life and physical, sexual, and psychological integrity supersedes perpetrators' private property rights. It's both our human rights, but one might be more important in some situations than others, so that you can limit it. And one last part, I think that's very important as a state obligation, is that states must also provide shelter and adequate housing for survivors and victims of domestic violence. So there must be a place where women can go when they're when their health and their well-being and when their life is threatened by the very partner they live with. And you can imagine that, because I've said that gender-based violence has been skyrocketing in times of crisis. This has been, of course, a problem during COVID, where women, where nobody could leave their house and homes. And you will see in the next state reporting cycle, I'm sure of it, that the CEDAW committee will have made recommendations, will have expressed its concern in concluding observations that there still must be shelter and there still must adequate housing in order for women to be safe. I will come to one more example if time allows, and that is the inquiry report on South Africa. You already know it's only something because South Africa have signed and ratified the optional protocol, and South Africa has also cooperated and provided consent for the CEDAW committee to come to South Africa to investigate the systematic and grave breaches that in particular have been going on with the failure to protect a significant number of women and girls from domestic violence, and where women could not leave abusive domestic relationships because they did not have enough means. And this has unnecessarily exposed them to gender-based violence, but it also has prolonged their suffering because South Africa basically did nothing, even though they knew that this situation was going on, and because they didn't take effective measures through removing, for instance, the economic and social barriers, because it's also something that the CEDAW committee has said on many instances: when women are economically empowered, when they have enough money, then they can leave abusive relationships. But this was also not the case. So a lot of women who would live in poverty in South Africa did not have the financial means, did not have another place to go where they could live in safety. And likewise, there wasn't an adequate and sufficient number of shelters where they could be protected. And the situation was particularly severe because the question came up in the chat box for women who are lesbian or bisexual, intersex or trans. They very like what I read from the inquiry report, very often shelters would be run by NGOs, but not all of them would accept LGBTIQ A+ persons. So for them, the situation was particularly dire. But also for women with disabilities, as soon as more intersectional discrimination criteria you fulfill, the worse in a way the protection was. And in the end, South Africa didn't fulfill its due diligence obligations towards all women, and it accepted these extremely high levels of domestic violence, and that was a problem. And I've mentioned, so the CEDAW committee again has great authority. It's a human rights treaty body that enjoys this authority because states gave it this authority, and it made several recommendations. It said, first, you have to provide access to justice and provide protection orders. So when a woman does complain to a judge that she's experiencing violence by her partner, then she must receive a protection order so that this partner cannot come back to the house where she lives, at least temporarily, until the situation gets better. Likewise, it recommended that there must be an access to shelters with sufficient capacity so that women can live in safety in those shelters and have enough space, and so that they can live there with their children and not be then threatened in shelters, for instance. And they must also have the security to stay in those shelters, and that means for states, for instance, that they must provide funding for those shelters. They also South Africa also must provide access to affordable housing. When women are poorer, they might not be able to then get access to housing, and we will connect this later to the land and housing section, because also very often women are disenfranchised from their housing rights, and that's also true, I believe, in South Africa. So it's also important that there's some place in a country where women can be safe, and it must be provided. And last, I think an important recommendation, and it again ties to property rights, is also that state parties must ensure that women are economically empowered so that they can gain autonomy and leave and also recover from abusive relationships. Like even if they may be trapped in an abusive relationship for some time, when they have, for instance, enough financial means, and when they have enough community also, then they might be able to free themselves from this situation, and states can do something in order for women to reclaim this autonomy. Okay, I think I would leave it there with the gender-based violence section and ask you, Amy, what part we should talk next about.
Yeah, it looks like the second most interesting part would be property rights in family relations. Mm-hmm. So we will just next move on to that section. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. So this part is also really important. Like you already learned about what could go wrong in family relations, and why it's important to have property rights, and why it's important to be economically empowered. And unlike in the gender-based violence, we now really talk about the backbone property provisions that are enshrined in the convention. And you can find them in Article 15 and 16. Article 15 is very, very important because it provides equality before the law to women. No matter what contract they sign, no matter what procedure, and also access to justice they could ask for in front of a judiciary, they must be treated equally to men. And this is not just a concept of formal equality where you just get half, but it's also a concept of substantive equality. In some scenarios, you would need to get something different in order to be treated equally. And that could be, for instance, and again, I think the gender-based violence cases are a good example where you could think about that a judiciary must ensure that a woman actually dares to give testimony. So you must train judges so that they understand that this is actually something that concerns gender-based violence, and we have to protect that woman. So you also have to have training for judiciary, and you have to have special procedures in place sometimes. But so Article 15 is really the concept of legal equality that's enshrined in the convention. And it's also a very, very important article for access to justice. Article 16 explicitly, and well, I should say that Article 15 also says that women have the equal rights to administer property. And that means in court proceedings, that means when you register property somewhere, that means whenever you basically deal with property rights in front of whatever public authority, women have the equal rights to administer that property. And Article 16, that really is the backbone provision of women's property rights in CEDAW, says that both spouses have the same rights in respect of ownership, acquisition, so when they buy a property, for instance, management, so that both parties can always decide what happens with that property without asking consent from a spouse, for instance, administration, and then enjoyment and disposition of property, when, for instance, and I will also get to this with regard to another communication, but one party couldn't decide to cross off the other party from the lease of the jointly owned property. And one part couldn't decide alone when they get rid of the property. But the woman would need to be in a position to always provide their consent to do so. So they have a right to administer that property on equal grounds. I've mentioned the general recommendations many times, and there is one that stands out and is fundamentally important in family relations, and that is General Recommendation 29 on economic consequences of marriage, family relations, and their dissolution. There was a preceding one, but I think this would get too complicated, but you can again see over time the committee has developed these general recommendations. And I've mentioned also the concept of intersectional discrimination. This is also where the CEDAW committee's work has been groundbreaking, and it issued two that I think are also very important in the family relations part, and that's the General Recommendation 27 on older women and General Recommendation 34 on rural women. And in those two, it also spoke to how these particularly situated women are affected by rights violations concerning their property rights. There are more, but I think let's work with those three to get the gist of it. So I would move on to the General Recommendation 29, 27, and 34. So I've mentioned state obligations in the beginning, and you will, like when you work with the CEDAW convention, that you will know one thing. It really shows up in your home. It shows up in families. It shows up also in areas that are governed by customary laws or religious laws in societies. And a lot of states do not like it to be monitored and implemented, to be monitored by the CEDAW committee in those areas. And very often states have constitutions in place that would then exclude family business, anything that's governed by customary or religious law from human rights protection. And one fundamentally important recommendation the committee has provided is that the equality within the family must be constitutionally protected. So states actually cannot, and it has recommended this to a lot of state parties, exclude family relations from human rights protection. But equality within the family must be constitutionally protected. So equal protection clauses must also apply to the family as the smallest unit of society. And I think this is very important. And this is also the reason, and I connected to what I have said in the beginning, that it is a universally ratified convention. This might be true, but the only reason why this is the case is that a lot of states have made reservations on exactly those two very important articles I just mentioned, Article 15 and 16, because they didn't want the CEDAW committee to come all the way home and to even come into the living rooms of people, so to say, and to say how states actually must protect also human rights in this smallest unit of society. Over time, and that is also something you see in the concluding observations and that you see in General Recommendation 29, the CEDAW committee has recommended to withdraw those reservations in order to also extend equal protection to family areas. And more states have done so. But I think it's important to know that this has been a very sensitive point for a lot of state parties. And this has been a process that has taken many years and that is still ongoing. But I think it is important to remember that equality within the family must be also protected by constitution and cannot be exempted. We already had the question, but so equality is protected in all forms of family relations. Whether it's a customary marriage, whether it's a polygamous union, and the CEDAW committee has also recommended to not have polygamous marriages for several reasons. But when there is a polygamous marriage, then equality must also be protected in this type of union, and it must be protected in registered partnerships, and equality must also be protected in de facto marriages. There are state parties around the world where it is not possible for LGBTIQA+ women to register their partnerships because people live in hiding and are not formally recognized by the state. And that's why, in general, the recommendation that de facto relationships also address people who live in same-sex relationships or in any form of non-heteronormative or queer relationship. But also their equality should be protected. Even if it's not the case around the world, the committee recommends this. And even if you can't register, I think there's then still the governing principle of equality that you should abide by, and in far as this is possible, achieve contractual equality for also LGBTIQA+ persons. I've already mentioned something that's important and that protects your rights usually is when you get a sort of record, and that's why the CEDAW committee also recommends marriage registration to protect property issues in all stages of a relationship, whether it's a marriage, a de facto relationship, a registered partnership, but it's, you know, when you are born and then someday you get together, sometimes you divorce and sometimes a partner dies before you, but in the entire cycle of a relationship, your equality should be protected, and that's important too. And when you can, then you should register so that you are on the record as an official spouse, so that you can claim half when a divorce is due or when a spouse dies. How can you protect this? Again, you need laws. And we all know that legal protection will only be one important piece, but legislation must guarantee that, you know, that's through family laws, that's through the constitutions that must change where equality applies. And that's also the case when we talk about rural women, and that's a recommendation that comes from General Recommendation 34, that legislation must also guarantee rural women's right to land on an equal basis with men, and irrespective of the civil or marital status. And the CEDAW committee recommends that rural women can make decisions over their lives without a male guardian or without a male guarantor. And again, registration is also so fundamentally important, but not enough. Because even if you're registered, but you can't decide and administer over your property, then that will not take you very far. So it's also important to have this additional protection, I would say. There should be no discrimination. I think that's where we really can talk more about the different forms of equality and the different forms of discrimination when it comes to the distribution and maintenance of property after divorce or as a separation. What is marital property? I think that is something that we also briefly must think about, and how this is different for women and men around the world. Very often women contribute to a marriage in unpaid form because they undertake care work, because they look after children or older people, people who are differently abled. And that means they spend less time in the labor market. And in the end, if they get divorced, then they, of course, have contributed less in financial assets, but they have contributed a lot of their unpaid work to a marriage. And the CEDAW committee has also made a very important recommendation that says that all this unpaid work and all these non-financial assets, they must be counted towards marital property. And they must be considered once a divorce takes place. And likewise, when, for instance, the partner who works and does training and improves their career, and the woman stays at home to enable this, then this is also something that must be considered in order to get a divorce. In general, the CEDAW committee favors a community property regime, because very often in separate property regimes, women walk with less in case they get a divorce, as I've just mentioned, because there are all these unpaid ways in which women contribute to the wealth of a family around the world. So it's better to have the community property regime, but it's also very important to then be registered, because otherwise that also would not be counted. But in general, the CEDAW committee also has been fundamentally important in making these non-financial contributions to a marriage visible, and to distribute them once there is a divorce. Another very important area is, of course, inheritance. And also here, the CEDAW committee has issued the recommendation that there must be equal rights of women as surviving spouses, and when they are testaors or heirs. In important communications, and we will come to them in detail in a moment, but the CEDAW committee has also said in those that, again, not the husband's family is managing the estate, but the woman on equal terms. So they are they must also have their fair share, and they must get half in case the spouse dies. And I already mentioned this, but I bring it up again. So prohibition of disinheritance has been important in some state parties. And the CEDAW committee has also issued recommendations. And this is what we would call the property grabbing, where, you know, a woman is not just that the husband or the spouse would die, but she would be expelled from the village. She wouldn't get any assets, even though she contributed to the marriage. And she would need to leave the premises of the husband without, and with her children, without any financial support, without, she basically would walk away with nothing and an enormous loss. And also here, the CEDAW committee has recommended that this must be prohibited, and that this is even a practice that must be criminalized, and where you have to introduce a penal code as a state party. Okay, there's much more we could say, but I would say we move on to an example of a concluding observation, because we have talked about those concluding observations a lot, and I will only mention 2 points. So how are these concluding observations structured? Usually the CEDAW committee starts by expressing concern and says what are human rights circumstances that must improve in a respective state party, and it then makes a recommendation. And in the next state report, the CEDAW committee will come back and ask the state, so we made this recommendation to you, what have you done about it to improve the situation? And Amy, I think I pass on to you now to say a bit more about the specific one.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. I think it's a good place for me to jump in, because it's directly related to China And I just want to point out that, as Judith said, the committee not just like issue observations or recommendations, they also like go back to old problem to see whether you've solved them, like ever since the last review. So I want to point out that China will soon be subject to another round of review by the committee in May. So it is actually quite interesting to check whether there has been any like positive changes since last one. So like actually on this page, the committee addresses like different questions about like marital property, about land rights and rights to inheritance. So towards the question of the like marital property, the housing rights, in the state party, the government does not actually specifically address this problem. I think partly because with the enactment of civil code and the new judicial interpretation by the Supreme People's Court, that controversial provision that has the impression that the property goes back to the original investor, that provision has already been removed. Yet the issue of rural women's land rights is still on the list of issues and will be a focus this year. So in the state report, the government actually recalled the specific paragraph of last recommendation, saying that, oh, in this one you ask about land rights. So they reported progress in legislation and in implementation in regard to rural women's land rights, land contracting rights, and women's membership in collective economic organizations. And like, I think the audience know better than I do, the later part will also have an ongoing like lawmaking, and we will soon see how that goes. So like in response to the state report, the committee also raised a couple of questions. They said that still a high proportion of women in rural areas do not have contracted land or homestead rights. About a quarter of land certificates do not include women's names, and only a very small percentage of women in farming household are registered as representatives. So they asked the government to provide statistics to show the improvement in these areas, which the government did. So like, this is a very complicated question and we cannot fully address it at the session, but it will be interesting to learn whether the committee believes the government has fulfilled its obligation under the convention to protect women's housing and land rights at the upcoming review. Judith has like provided some information about the review, and you will see them towards the end of the presentation. And you can also find relevant information in the study package. So please stay tuned. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Amy, for this excellent input. And I think that makes it also more explicit when I say concluding observation, what do we actually mean by that? And I think we come in the question part and on the last slide to the procedure once more. But maybe let's only do one communication now. And I think it might be better to talk about Cecilia Cal very briefly and then a bit more about ES versus Tanzania. So I already mentioned Canada and that they are very open to receiving the communications by the CEDAW committee, and there also has been this individual communication and an individual complaint to Canada. It came to the CEDAW committee because Cecilia Kell, she was an Indigenous Canadian woman, was arbitrarily evicted from the house she jointly owned with her husband. Her husband was abusing her, was exercising domestic violence against her, and he was on the lease with her to own this house together because it was an Indigenous housing scheme. He was not Indigenous, she was. And he evicted her, exchanged the locks while she was at a domestic violence shelter and not at home, and would then send her a letter by a lawyer saying that she no longer owns the property. So we are dealing with a violation of Article 16 because she has a right to administer and Article 15 and 16, and she has a right to administer this property, and she has a right to own it and equal parts. She complained to the Canadian courts. First, nobody wanted to take on her case because as an Indigenous woman and as a poorer woman, she also experienced discrimination in her access to justice. And eventually she was not getting a verdict, and she couldn't afford the access to justice in front of the Supreme Court. So she exhausted all legal remedy and got to the CEDAW committee. The CEDAW committee said this is a violation and you violated Cecilia Kell's rights because the state didn't protect her against her husband, a private party. So it violated due diligence obligations, and it also violated her right to administer property under Article 16(1)(h). And it then made a recommendation that has been, again, important in subsequent state practice and in recommendations to states. And on an individual level, the CEDAW committee recommended to provide housing commensurate in quality, location, sites to the one she was deprived of. And it also recommended to provide appropriate monetary compensation for the material and moral damages she suffered, and that would speak to the gravity of the violations she experienced. But it also made a very important recommendation on a general level, because Indigenous women in Canada apparently experience discrimination in their access and justice. So it basically said you have to recruit and train more Aboriginal women so that women get legal aid, and so that women have legal aid to also do something against the domestic violence or in order to claim their property rights, and also to review the legal aid system in order to improve Indigenous women's access to justice. So these issues are all connected. But let's come briefly to the very last point. Another very important communication, and here we are dealing with an inheritance case. I briefly already mentioned it. Two Tanzanian women, when their husband died, they were completely disenfranchised by family property. They were like the husband's family managed the estate and basically told them to leave with their children without having any access to financial resources. In that case, a US law school took on the case and helped them to complain to the CEDAW committee after the Tanzanian court said, well, look, we know this is discriminatory and our customary inheritance system is discriminatory, but all customary legal systems are discriminatory and we can't change this for all communities. And the CEDAW committee viewed this differently and said that there happened also a violation of these Tanzanian women's inheritance rights. And it provided several recommendations. I will not go into them in detail, but just say, again, Tanzania had to provide appropriate reparation and adequate compensation. It also had to undertake a constitutional review. As I mentioned before, like it also must be constitutionally protected to have equality in property rights and in family relations, and that also concerns inheritance rights in and even when they're governed by customary law. The committee recommended to repeal and amend all discriminatory customary laws. And it also said that you should promote dialogue, bring all stakeholders to a table in order to discuss how these laws should be changed. It also said to provide access to the judiciary so that you can complain to the courts and that they do something about violations when they occur, and to also educate and raise awareness among women so that they know about their rights. I mean, it's something that we do here today, but it's also a very important part of human rights protection. Okay, I would say let's move on to the last part, which I think will be the shortest with a view to time, if that's okay.
Yeah, Judith, I think we are like sort of behind the time right now. And
yes.
Also we have already like covered quite a lot about like landing rights. So maybe you just in like 1 or 2 slides have a very brief introduction of this area, and we can just move on to advocacy and Q&A.
Yes, I think that sounds excellent. So let's give it max 3 minutes. Okay, so I think I already mentioned the most important provisions on land and housing rights are enshrined in Article 13 and 14 of the Convention. Article 14 ensures rural women's access and right to land, and Article 14 also ensures rural women's housing rights. Again, the interpretation of the committee is very important because it has extended these rights over time also to women who are not rural women. And you have, in addition, Article 13, where you could also derive this from, but in the end, all women enjoy housing rights and all women enjoy land rights, but it's particularly relevant for rural women. Again, there are a couple of general recommendations where the committee has fleshed this out. I only mentioned general recommendation 27 on older women, general recommendation 34 on rural women. It's one of the most important ones. I think general recommendation 37 on climate change is also worth a read, and general recommendation 39 on indigenous women. But if you had to choose one, I would only address general recommendation 34. And that's maybe the one we close it with because it contains all the important information. So what I want you to take away is that rural women have a fundamental right to land. The committee has said that very clearly, and rural women also have equal rights to land and to have them equally distributed, registered. They have a right to titling and also certificates. So again, to be on that lease, if there is one, is very important. If there is major land acquisition, then it's very important that women provide first the informed consent, that they have a say in development project, that land is not just taken from them, and that a forced eviction does not happen. And if a forced eviction happens, then it's very important to provide adequate compensation. And as a temporary special measure, you know, that's something states immediately must do. It's important that women can also benefit from land distribution or any land schemes or use of land if that's a problem in a state party. I would say we jump over the concluding observations because you can read that with the slides, and it's summarizing different concluding observations that were issued to state parties around the world. But I just want to point out, because we talked about intersectional discrimination, that especially with regard to adequate housing rights, intersectional discrimination is a problem. And especially women who are heads of household or live in poverty, women with disabilities, or also older women, they all must enjoy access to adequate housing. And it's very important that they are especially protected and that state parties ensure this. Okay, I would leave it there and jump to our final slide because all this information is only useful to you when you also know where to find more information and then you can figure out how to, how to get access to the CEDAW committee. And as Amy has already briefly pointed out, so the state reporting is a procedure that takes place every 4 years. And in May, there will be the next state reporting cycle. I know that, for instance, the neighboring country, Germany, will be on the agenda, but I think also China will be on the agenda. And because state reports are something that are discussed publicly before the CEDAW committee provides concluding observations in a report to the respective state party, it's also something where a worldwide audience is able to tune in and watch the CEDAW committee when it sits together, the 23 experts, and provides these recommendations on the UN Web TV. And I believe we have provided you a link to this. I also believe that that the state reporting information regarding the next Chinese state report will take place on 12th of May, Central European time, but I think you can also watch it online afterwards. But it's one thing I want to mention, and I've also discussed it with German colleagues. The CEDAW committee is shifting procedures, and that brings me also to a question that has come up in the audience. What are weaknesses and strengths? And we are experiencing it right now. The CEDAW committee is also a body with extremely limited resources and extremely limited time. And usually the CEDAW experts, there's one CEDAW expert per article, there's a country special rapporteur, but they have very, very, very little time to look at each individual country. And they will have even less time in the future, and civil society will even have less time to participate in the process, because the CEDAW committee is shifting to a simplified reporting procedure. And the countries that are present at the current session and that they had to deliver their state report are the last ones who get a full reporting procedure. And 4 years from now, so for instance, in Germany, they now have the long state report. The civil society wrote a shadow report. I show you one from the country where I'm from. You can't really see, but it's the shadow report that civil society in Austria wrote. It will be even much more difficult for Austrian civil society to write that shadow report at the next state reporting cycle, because they must already hear about a list of questions that is discussed in a pre-sessional working group. And you can also find that information online so that they can submit their shadow report ahead of time. And then the next state report for Austria will only be a reply to the list of questions, the list of issues Austria receives from the CEDAW committee. So it will be a much simplified process. And then there will be, one day, like whatever day it is in the session, where the Austrian delegation will present the report, and then they get the concluding observations. But it's not like now that you have, that you have a long state report and that you have a list of issues and questions, and that this procedure really takes years in preparation. But next time, everything will be much shorter. And I think that is unfortunately something that's a weakness, but I think it's important to know for people who want to pay attention to human rights treaty bodies in Geneva, how they can actually engage. So I would suggest visit the website and inform yourselves about this important change. But at this session, the state reporting will take place as planned. I should also announce the CEDAW committee is busy, so they're already working on the next general recommendation that goes to all state parties. And the next one will be on the equal and inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems. It's also possible to make submissions to the CEDAW committee and to upload them then on the webpage, and also to participate in the making of a general recommendation. But that we would need to do a follow-up webinar on, because that I think takes more time to explain. And yes, last, so that if state party has signed on to the optional protocol, great. But even if it hasn't, then I think it's good to learn about the different procedures, because they will impact concluding observations and general recommendations, and will help people around the world to understand how the CEDAW committee understands that the rights that states sign up for bind them, and what obligations they have in order to protect women property rights around the world.